This episode of Warrior Radio is brought to you by our web store, which you can find at warrior.do/store. We provide tools to hack consciousness and upgrade the mind. And one of our more popular products is Warrior Kratom. And kratom comes from the leaves of a tropical evergreen tree native to Southeast Asia. And for hundreds of years, natives of Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia have chewed on its leaves to relieve minor pain, lift mood, aid in relaxation, and boost energy. And for the past few years, I've actually lived in Bali, Indonesia, which Indonesia is the largest exporter of kratom in the world. So living in the kratom mecca, I've literally reached out to every kratom farmer I could find and tried all the different strains I can get my hands on. And I'm offering the very best kratom I've found while I've been out here, which is again great for relieving minor pain, promoting relaxation, and supporting a balanced mood. Personally, my favorite is the Bali Reds, which is just amazing for relaxing at the end of your day, which I personally use about twice a week. Use the coupon code RADIO to get 10% off all our consciousness hacking technology and mind-enhancing herbs. In this episode of Warrior Radio, I sit down with Adam Curry, who is an inventor, tech entrepreneur in the field of consciousness research. And Adam created an app called Entangled, which explores how consciousness can possibly affect the nature of reality itself. And this is really built off of the work in the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, or PEAR Lab, which was really famous for a number of studies they did which involved random number generators, or RNGs. And in the studies, they found that participants were actually able to affect the output of these RNGs based off of their thoughts and intentions. Another project that kind of ran with this idea was the Global Consciousness Project. And they set up RNGs throughout the world to see if global events would actually deviate the RNG's output. And sure enough, the project found that events like 9/11 not only affected its output, but it did so hours before the event actually took place. So a lot of these findings, they sort of beg a few different questions. Does our consciousness actually affect our physical reality? Is there a collective consciousness? Is consciousness tied to brain activity, or is it an intrinsic aspect of reality itself? So Adam's app called Entangled, it sort of takes all of this research to the next level. So Entangled uses various systems off your phone to create a random number generator, which is actually a lot harder than most people realize, and that's what we get into in this episode. But once this RNG is sort of in place in the phone, it sort of runs in the background, recording any deviation from randomness by its user. So with a user base around the world, the app could actually measure how things like mass meditation, how things like natural disasters and wars or other collective events can affect the output of these RNGs. So in today's episode, I pick his brain on all the research I just mentioned, but also how the Entangled technology, how it's pushing this field of research forward. So if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, Warrior Radio. Subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a rating, as ratings are actually what push our podcast up the iTunes store and get a lot of these little talked about, little understood, sort of fringe topics out into the masses. So with all that said, let's dive into today's episode with Adam Curry. Enjoy it. For those that don't know, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Adam Curry. I'm an inventor and tech entrepreneur. I have been in the consciousness research field for about 15 years, but more seriously in about the past 5 years or so. I was part of a laboratory run by the Dean of Engineering called the PEAR Lab, which is an acronym that stands for Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. And we were basically looking at the mind powers in an engineering laboratory setting at the university. But more later as a technology entrepreneur in Silicon Valley and Irvine, exploring how we might tap into consciousness or harness consciousness and all its mysterious forms to improve technology, basically to do new things technologically that we were unable to do before because we didn't really understand what consciousness is and what it can do.
Awesome. Well, I want to definitely pick your brain on your Entangled app, like we were saying before. But before we dive into that, can you tell us a little bit about your backstory, just how you got into just this consciousness research and exploration field, sort of the story before the PEAR Lab and how you eventually got into this field?
Yeah, I'll give you the truncated version, but it begins like all great adventures begin with an unlikely coincidence. So when I was, I think like 15, my parents took me to a bookstore, and I was walking down one of the aisles and I saw a book that was sitting off the shelf. So I picked it up and I opened it, and I read the first passage or the first few pages, and the book was discussing this laboratory called the PEAR Laboratory at Princeton that was doing research to show that the human mind, the subjects in the lab, were able to influence the output of random number generators, which is crazy. It was really mind-blowing, and it was basically showing that there might be more to our minds than we ever really thought possible. Wow, that's awesome. So the next day, or I think it was that week sometime, I went out to the movies with my friends, and we needed a ride home, so my friend's father drove us back. And as he was driving us back, he started talking about this conference and these people from Princeton that were looking at this effect on random number generators, and that he was going to go. And I said, oh, that's crazy. I just read about that a few days ago. I said, oh, wow. Well, if you'd like to come with me, I can make the introduction. So I did. It was my first science conference. It was kind of an unusual science conference. It was academics who were professional academics in their own right, but had an interest in studying the unusual and the unexplained, but in a scientific manner. And so I was the youngest person there by far. But I went and I was kind of taken under the wing of Brenda Dunn, who was the lab manager at the PEAR Lab, and became from that point quite close with Bob John, the dean who founded the lab, and Brenda, who ran it. And they were doing consciousness research. And so I, in my summers, would intern at the lab, just help with experiments and nothing too serious. But as I sort of graduated college and was planning on what to do next, some friends of mine also from the PEAR Lab and I got together and created a really unique company back in like 2007, 2008. It was called Psyleron, and it was born out of the PEAR Lab at Princeton. And what we were trying to do is take these random number generators that the university had found were amenable to the influence of the human mind and use them as sensing devices, I guess, that could go in consumer electronics that would allow humans to interface with technologies using just their thoughts. And we didn't know if this would work or how it could work or what we could build, but it was a really exciting time for us where we were just building products and exploring and tinkering. And so we did that for about 3 years, and we discovered a lot of interesting applications and possibilities, and we sold some products. And by the time we were kind of in our mid-20s, it was sort of time to move on from that. And so we went out west to San Francisco and landed in the beginning, I guess, of the current tech boom, 2011, and got jobs doing startup stuff. And in the back of my mind, I always really wanted to try to connect the basic consciousness research from the PEAR Lab and what we were doing at Psyleron to what was happening in Silicon Valley. And that is where Entangled comes from.
Awesome. Super, super interesting. And I want to get into some of the things that you were doing with PEAR and Psyleron, which are all connected to consciousness. And when people hear that term, it's kind of it's hard to describe in words, and a lot of times it's sort of wrapped in ambiguity and mystery. So before we move on to describing some of those projects that you're part of, how would you best describe consciousness?
Yeah, the definitions are important. In this case, the definition of consciousness is a very tricky one, and it kind of means different things to different people. So if you're putting on your scientist hat, when you say consciousness, what you mean is you're kind of trying to stand back from the phenomena of awareness and try to figure out what's going on. So consciousness in that sense means the fact that you have a mind, the fact that you have a first-person experience, the fact that you can think things, that you have a sense of volition, the fact that you have emotions, that you can have qualia, seeing colors, listening to music, enjoying yourself. So that is consciousness, right? It's the wakefulness, the first-person perspective.
And
it turned...
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it turns out that it's actually very difficult to explain why consciousness is there at all. We kind of stop at this explanation of, oh, well, it's the brain producing it. But okay, that may be. But why is the brain producing consciousness? In other words, if there's a collection of neurons and they're sending chemical messages back and forth, all of that should be able to happen through the laws of physics and chemistry and biology without the need for a first-person experience to be attendant to that process. So why is there one? And that's really the hard question here. It gets more complicated when you look at the apparently unusual abilities of consciousness, for example, to shift the output of random number generators. So the plot thickens.
Yeah, and a lot of people refer to this issue as the hard problem of consciousness. How how do these physical processes in the brains, these random firings of neurons, give rise to this subjective experience of the mind? And in one of your talks, you were talking about there's kind of two camps in this consciousness field, where one camp says consciousness is really just this byproduct of neurons firing in the brain, and another sort of newer camp says consciousness is actually sort of an intrinsic aspect of the universe itself and everything around you. So can you talk about these two areas and these two camps and kind of where you fall in this spectrum?
I fall on the intrinsic perspective, but the first perspective is basically that consciousness is like an illusion. It's an illusion produced by the brain. Okay, and this comes from the past 100 so years of a trend in thinking about reality, which we call materialism or reductionism. And it basically is the assumption that everything that exists is physical, is material, and nothing exists that is not material or processes of material things, right? So consciousness is, therefore, must be, from that point of view, an illusion produced by the machinations of a very complex organ we call the brain. There's a couple of problems with that, and we won't get into all of them, but one of them is that to say that consciousness is an illusion is to say that, well, it's kind of a logical fallacy, because you need consciousness to experience anything, including illusions, right? So you're presupposing the existence of the very thing that you're trying to argue doesn't exist. So that's, once you can wrap your mind around that, the philosophy side of consciousness becomes very interesting. Okay, so what's the alternative? Well, where can you look for possible counter theories? Well, you could look, if you're brave, in the world of parapsychology, where you're seeing things like sort of remote viewing or the remote perception programs of the CIA and the Army that existed for many years. You could look to something like what the PEAR Lab or what the Institute of Noetic Sciences has been doing about the ability of the human mind to shift probabilistic or quantum phenomena in ways that don't make any sense to us. And or you could look more at the universe writ large. So you could take a cosmological point of view and say, okay, well, if consciousness is something that seems to be resisting the ability for us to draw a box around it, maybe the universe itself is consciousness. Maybe instead of consciousness being an illusion emergent from physical processes or matter, maybe physical matter and consciousness are two sides of the same coin. Maybe even it's upside down, where consciousness is fundamental or intrinsic to the universe, and the material world is somewhere in that spectrum. We don't really know exactly, but I think that's where the debate is. So those are kind of the two perspectives right now. And the intrinsic consciousness perspective is, although it's nothing new from the point of view of the history of human thought, it is fairly new from the point of view of academics really embracing this issue, largely as a result of having to reject the logical fallacy of materialism. I think we can see the boundaries of materialism starting to break down, or the abilities of materialism sort of breaking down when it tries to explain consciousness.
Now, PEAR, which from my understanding is Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, they have a history of exploring consciousness, and this idea that if consciousness is sort of this field that sort of interpenetrates us and surrounds all of us. And like you were saying, they set up this random number generator experiment to investigate some of these things. So can you take us through a little bit of the history of how that experiment got set up and some of the early findings that they saw?
Sure. So the story begins, well, where does the story begin? Our story begins in 1977. And in 1977, there was a meeting that was convened in North Carolina. I believe it was at a place called Quail Hollow. And it was a small group of leading scientists and I guess what you might call thought leaders in sort of the new age. I guess that was sort of the term used for it back then. But a couple of people were in attendance, and one was Bob John, who is the dean of the engineering school at Princeton. And Bob was he had already accomplished so much in his career. He was the grandfather of plasma propulsion, and there's a whole generation of spacecraft currently flying around in space that utilize plasma propulsion, and had contributed in a number of different ways. Also present was Edgar Mitchell, who was the Apollo 14 astronaut, and he had come back from his trip to the moon, where he was the sixth man to walk on the moon. And Bob was there because Bob had a student at Princeton that wanted to explore consciousness basically using random number generators, and he had no interest or previous experience with this, but they got some really unusual results that he was left unable to explain, and we can get more into the history of that experiment. And Edgar was there, having returned from the mission, having had something like a transcendent experience, classically described in the literature, and feeling that, much like Bob, his scientific career or his professional career had kind of reached certain heights, and to push forward more into the dimensions of the spiritual, more into the dimensions of the question of consciousness, the deep questions, was really the next step for them. And so Edgar famously went on to found the Institute of Noetic Sciences, still operating today, and Bob went back to the university and created the PEAR Lab in 1979. So the PEAR Lab is most famous for their random number generator experiments. And it's a very simple experiment to understand. The implications, however, are really difficult to pick apart. So what is a random number generator? Well, it's a device that produces a random string of ones and zeros. And those ones and zeros don't come from computer programs, but they're representations of physical things. So, for example, the way that an radioactive element decays, you get these particles that fly off of it in crazy erratic ways. Well, that's intrinsically random. That process is intrinsically random. And so if you have a detector around a radioactive element, and it's able to sort of detect where these decaying particles are landing in their behavior, you can turn that into, basically you can represent that with ones and zeros. Another way to do it would be to look at quantum tunneling phenomena, or electron tunneling, which is basically you force electrons into a into having to make a quantum decision, I guess. You have an electromagnetic barrier, and you fire electrons, tons of them, at this barrier, and they either sort of bounce off or they tunnel through. And that tunneling through is a quantum effect. It's sort of like they teleport to the other side. That's the quantum leap. And it's, again, an intrinsically random process, meaning that we cannot predict the behavior of the next electron based on the behavior that came before it. So if you look at the bouncing and the tunneling, and you can represent those bouncings and those tunnels with zeros and ones, and so you put it together and you have this really nice 50-50 distribution of ones and zeros. And so let's say that you run this machine and it produces these 50-50 balance, and statistically it looks clean, all is right with the world, until you get somebody to sit in front of the machine and you ask them to pick whether they want the device to produce more ones or more zeros, which is usually represented by a graph on a screen. The graph moves up if it's producing more ones, it moves down if more zeros. And the person intends, using just their intention, to move the device up, and it does. So you record a chunk of data in a predefined way, and you can run very easy statistics on this, just binary statistics. Pretty soon you can tell with a degree of certainty based on probability that there is some sort of unexplained effect that correlates with the direction that person was trying to make the thing go. So that's what the PEAR Lab did in many different instantiations over many years, collecting it all into a database. And it definitely exceeds the levels of statistical significance by far that mainstream science needs to say that something is real. So they really proved without a shadow of a doubt, if you're going to use the same metrics as mainstream science, that there's something going on here. There is something about our minds that can move this around, and the question isn't, can anyone do it, or is it possible? It seems that basically everyone can do it. Some are a little better than others. But the question is really of a theoretical of the model, right? Like, how do we explain this effect at all? And so I think that can kind of come into the discussion now between the materialists' perspective on consciousness, meaning that it's illusion, and the sort of intrinsic perspective on consciousness, meaning that consciousness pervades the universe, it is everywhere. And I think that I think the RNG data really point to the intrinsic explanation. If only because it provides something like a way to understand how two things can be disconnected in physical space. If your consciousness, meaning your intention to move the device up, is also part of the fabric of physical reality, then it is thereby connected to the random number generator as well.
This at the time was groundbreaking. This I'm sure the reactions from the scientific community were quite mixed. So can you talk a little bit about how the people in the community were reacting to these type of results?
So yeah, I think that even Bob was surprised. He knew that it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you didn't talk about consciousness. It was a 4-letter word. It was the C word. You didn't mention it. And you certainly didn't do experiments showing that consciousness could do things that violated or seemed to violate at the time the standard model of physics. So he knew that the people involved in the experiments had to be top-notch, which they were. Very, very high-quality people, including himself. And he knew that the experimental protocols had to be totally bulletproof, which they were. The stats, very good, and you needed to really bring a high level of carefulness to the experiments, which he did. And I think that what surprised him is that even though all those things were brought in the papers and so forth, he was still, it wasn't rejected, but it was met with scorn in many cases, or it was ignored in the early days. Not everyone. There were people at Princeton and people elsewhere, high-level people, Nobel laureates all the time, that would, in private, come up to him or visit the PEAR Lab and say, I think what you guys are doing is amazing. Please continue. But they would never promote it publicly. So what you had is a handful of very noisy, very obnoxious skeptics who rejected the material, not so much on the basis of the quality of the experiments, but on the basis of the subject matter. And that was a battle that was fought, and in some ways is still being fought to the present. Although what's happened recently is consciousness is no longer something that you need to avoid in academia. Quite the opposite. It's actually the hottest thing. I think most of your schools now are probably guaranteed they're all discussing it, consciousness, and they're going to approach it from different ways. But this is what the kids are asking about. This is what the kids want to study. Obviously, in the Valley with consciousness hacking, it's there was a Wired article that came out last week saying that consciousness hacking is Silicon Valley's new non-religion. So it's a way to bring meaningfulness in a safe and secular way into people that are kind of uncomfortable with how it's been presented before, namely religion. Or, on the other hand, like kind of woo-woo, new age science that isn't really good, like isn't really proper science. And so consciousness, however, comes out of this world of rigorous science, of like quality thought, but it still, I think, preserves a lot of the meaningfulness, the potential, the kind of spirituality, the connection to something more, the connection to possibility in one another, that I think is perhaps a hole that has been around in secular society that it's filling. So because of that, academia is much more friendly to these subjects, and I think as the frameworks move out of a strict materialistic perspective and into new ways of thinking, then we can imagine new ways, new mechanisms by which, for example, the mind might influence random number generators, and it doesn't seem so weird. It might actually, I think the new theories that are coming on board would actually predict this stuff.
Well, you were saying that when you were at PEAR, you kind of had this offshoot company called Psyleron that explored, from my understanding, consciousness and technology. Did you take any of the ideas and ran with them with Psyleron that you were kind of working with PEAR? And if so, what were the type of projects that you worked on?
Sure. So when PEAR closed in 2007, some friends and I got together under this company called Psyleron. And we wanted to make sure, first of all, that people could continue the research that PEAR did. So we made these low-cost random number generators that cost a few $100s, and you could plug it into your computer, and there was software that would allow you to do research. So we did that for the community, and we thought maybe there'd be a couple of hundred people who'd be interested in it. It turns out there were thousands who bought the random number generators, and so that gave us some more runway to raise some money. And the next thing that we built was this device called the Mind Lamp. And basically, it's a lamp that sits on your desk, and it glows white. And there's a random number generator inside. And when it behaves strangely, for example, like when somebody would be thinking at the device, right, sort of engaging the device, then it will turn a color. And so what you could do is you could say, I want this white lamp to turn, orange. And then you could try to get it to turn orange. And it works really well. It was spooky the first few times that we did it. Is one of the first times that the feedback about what the random number generator was doing was in something that wasn't techie. It wasn't a graph, on a screen, but it was a fun device. And it was interactive, and the results of that were great. So we made a bunch of those, and we sold those for years, and it was really fun. And sort of nearing the end there, the apps were really taking off. So what I wanted to do was to make a mobile app that took the same sort of research and sort of gave it away to people. And so the last thing we did at Psyleron basically was we prototyped a new kind of random number generator that worked by measuring the least significant bit on the accelerometer. Basically, it's just looking at hardware noise to create these random numbers. And then we ran an experiment where we had people download this app, and it would convert the hardware on their phone into random numbers, and they would try to make the graph on their screen move up or down. This data was collected and sent to a backend, and the results were pretty good. So that would have been 2010, and then we kind of moved on to other projects out in San Francisco, but I always wanted to carry that forward and do more with the mobile app stuff. And I remember one time I was the product manager for a venture-backed mobile social photo commerce company. We were right there in South Park in San Francisco, next to Instagram, and in the same building where Twitter started, and had ex-Google employees that came to work on this project. And it was all the ingredients of things that should have made a successful mobile startup company in 2011, right? But in the back of my mind, there was this voice that was like, work on the consciousness thing, keep doing the random number generator stuff. Mm-hmm. And not only this voice, but all of these kind of synchronicities, right? So these funny little messages that were really pulling me in that direction. And so I eventually left and said, okay, I'm going to somehow raise money for a free random number generator app that we're going to build. And so I did. Not easily. It took many years to find the right partner and to find the right people. And I sort of, it's a long story, but ended up kind of funding it myself. And that project, exploring consciousness and technology through smartphones and other systems like that, is within the aegis of a new company or project, I guess, called Entangled, which is sort of where we are today.
And Entangled, does that run off the same technology that you used with Psyleron, how it was kind of working off the data off the accelerometer, or is this a new type of system that you created?
Where it's landed right now is a hybrid. So we tried all kinds of different methods to get good random numbers on a smartphone. A number of people have tried, right, besides us, and it wasn't so good. It turns out that it's very hard to get really good, robust random numbers on a phone, which you need if you're going to, say that you're doing some sort of experiment. And so we looked at tapping into the phone and using pixels on the phone that are reading ambient light, but Apple really tries to control what processes your apps use in the background. So one of the things we wanted to do that was important to us is to be able to measure random numbers constantly on every person's phone. Kind of try to recreate what the Global Consciousness Project did, that project that had the random numbers around the world that showed that huge spike on September 11th. And so we wanted to, it was important for us to have really robust random numbers that we could generate continuously, and that was deeply challenging. It was easier on Android because Google doesn't care as much about things like battery life and the way that your apps integrate. But of course, Apple's a very closed system and everything is controlled. So we started with Apple. So anyway, where we landed is kind of a hybrid where we have local random numbers being collected when we can. We kind of found ways to sort of wake the phone up, kind of like hack the phone to make it wake up, and we'll collect some data. And then that is sent to a central server. And when we're unable to get data for that person, we've kicked in it's actually, like, I'm calling it a photon server, but it's a quantum system that we're building now, like a real quantum system that will give each user their own, almost like their own double slit data, their own quantum stream. And then we kind of flag where the local device stopped. And then we instigate a non-local quantum device producing the numbers. And I actually am kind of glad that we ended up doing it this way, because the bug became a feature. So we'll be able to do a really unique kind of experiment where we can answer this question, and that is the effects due to consciousness, or any effects due to consciousness, distance dependent? In other words, if it's on your phone, is the effect greater, versus if it's a server that's producing random number generators far away from you, but your consciousness is still, if you will, collapsing the wave function remotely when you observe the output or the outcome. So I'm really excited about that.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know the Entangled's still in beta from what I understand, but have you gathered any meaningful insights based off of the limited data and the current users that you've been
Yes.
that you've gathered?
So much. Okay. Yeah, we have a wait list of 11,000 people right now. It's huge. Wow. And we've done no marketing. Yeah. This has been such an interesting, it's extremely challenging to do this app right. Extremely challenging. It doesn't sound like it, but it is. But at the same time, it's been gloriously easy to find people who care, right? Because I think it's because this app is asking questions that people care about, and there's nothing else out there like it, like at all. So our wait list is so huge because like journalists and bloggers and podcasters keep reaching out and wanting to do stories. But we have learned a couple of interesting things, like sort of research-based or effect-based things. And one is, there's always this debate when it comes to the consciousness stuff, which is, let's take the Global Consciousness Project, for example. You have 70 random number generators spread around the world. They've been measuring and collecting data for consistently for 20 years. Every so often, there's a big event in the world that polarizes mass attention. 9/11, let's say. And the network of these devices showed that they all kind of behaved less randomly. So, for example, they started to behave in a more ordered way a couple of hours before the first plane struck, and they really shot up in terms of their covariance or their coherence with one another as the plane struck and as people had this sort of reaction. So there's always this question about what you're measuring, right? Are you measuring a field of consciousness? Think like a collective consciousness field, this invisible thing that permeates everything, and it's all around us, right? The ways in which we're invisibly connected. Are you actually measuring that? Kind of like a thermometer would be measuring ambient temperature. Or are you measuring something that's a little more personal? The people that are stakeholders in the Global Consciousness Project who have heard about it or are going to hear about it, do they at some deep level, some subconscious level, have an expectation that the network is going to be so coherent during those big emotional events? And if so, are they the ones that are influencing the network to behave in that way? And this has been kind of the debate, and I've actually landed more on the latter. My opinion is more on the latter. I think that one of the interesting things about this stuff is that the random number generators, or to put it another way, physical reality, can be affected based on your expectations and beliefs. Okay, based on things that are meaningful to you. So even though that's kind of more my interpretation of the Global Consciousness Project at this point, it's definitely something I've learned that I'm going to be putting into Entangled. And to make that more concrete, when you do get the app, you'll see that there's a tab on the app with experiments. And you can read about these experiments that we're doing, and the user can choose to opt in to those experiments. So what we're giving the user is I think for the first time, is we're giving them the ability to say, okay, I'm going to lend my subconscious mind to this experiment, and I'm going to allow it to affect the device in such a way that's going to produce data for the experiment. So an example would be earthquake prediction. If we're just looking at the network of entangled users, and there's an earthquake, and there's a spike in the network, it might be related, but it might be kind of the experimenter effect, right? So the experimenters might be expecting to see some sort of spike in the network, or the people involved might be, which is going to cause the spike in the first place when they go to measure it. So you can never really know. It's also slippery slope when it comes to doing really good science, where you can specify everything ahead of time. However, if you give the users the option of affecting a bit stream subconsciously for a specific purpose in very predefined criteria, now you're tapping into the power of a bunch of people lending their own experimenter effects or their own beliefs or expectations or desires to the data stream, to the experiment. And I think, we'll see what happens, but I think that we're going to get some pretty good results that way. So I was starting to describe the experiment. So one of the experiments is an earthquake prediction experiment, or an earthquake covariance. I don't know if I want to predict earthquakes or just show that spikes in the network covary with the earthquakes. But so you're a user. You open the app, you see these cool things. And one is an earthquake experiment, and it says, okay, what we're looking for is the random number generators on the phones of all these users, the apps of all these users. We're looking for spikes that happen bang on when an earthquake of a certain magnitude in an area happens, or maybe even beforehand, let's say 15 minutes beforehand. You're like, oh, that's cool. I've always wondered if at some deep level we all are very sensitive or even psychic. So you opt into that, and then you forget. Well, your subconscious mind has not forgotten. So if indeed we can sense the future to some degree, or we can maybe it's not even sensing the future, but it's maybe somehow sensing the physical world around us changing as a result of an earthquake about to happen. Your subconscious mind is going to do its whatever it does because of intrinsic consciousness to affect the random number generator. And we'll be able to, after the earthquake happens, extract that data out, look at the people who had opted in, and put it all together and see if indeed we're predicting the future, and or if we're having anomalous covariant effects, meaning there's a network-wide spike around the earthquake.
That's amazing. And from what I understand, you're also looking at things like mass meditation or concerts and things like that. And I was going to ask, have you ever noticed like a person's ability to sort of offset the random numbers generated based off of, I guess there's different states of consciousness. So those after meditating, or those during sort of a psychedelic experience, or maybe after a TDCS session. Have you ever noticed, saw any offshoot of randomness based off of those type of states?
Yes. So the question is there a state of mind or something that you can do that's going to make you more powerful at affecting reality? It's going to make you more like Neo in the Matrix.
Yes, yes.
And so the answer is yes, but there's a caveat. So here's the funny thing. Whenever somebody does something that, especially that they feel is going to give them extra abilities, it's going to make them more like Neo, if they do an experiment, they're going to get a pretty high effect. But then if they do the same thing the next day and the same thing the next day, the effect almost always declines back to where it was. So there's something about the first time or the first few times that you do something that is where the real power lies in this stuff. And there's so many parallels that you can draw in your own life, right? So the Zen mind, right? Beginner's mind or beginner's luck. And so you do this enough and you realize that what we're doing generally is we're finding things that are meaningful to us, like, we dropped that acid, or we meditated for an hour, or we are feeling really good, right? And you'll do these experiments and you're going to get good results. And forget about experiments, but you might be trying to write a new song, or you're writing a story or something, and you do all those things and the magic really happens, right? Those first few times, and you try it again, guess what? It's not as powerful as before. So we see that in the RNG studies just very, very clearly. Okay, now I said the answer was yes, but. So the but is the decline effect. The yes is that there is one thing that, if you will, more or less universally does seem to improve a person's ability at affecting the devices, and that's meditation. So regular meditators in general are much better at affecting the physical world around them. And the PEAR Lab kind of showed the early research surrounding that, hinted at that. We saw it very clearly we saw it in some cases at Psyleron, but the work of Dean Radin at IONS, what Dean's doing over there, has shown that very, very clearly. And what he's doing is he's taking two groups of people, one non-meditators and one meditators, and he's firing single photons down a path to a device that can measure if the photon goes in direction A or B. And it should be a 50-50 random process, and it turns out that it's skewed more one way when the subjects in the experiment are asked to try to observe or bend the photon down the direction towards one detector versus the other, right? So whereas it was 50-50, now maybe it's 48-52 in the direction of the people who are remotely trying to make the photons move in one way or the other. Now, the people that didn't meditate had virtually zero effect. The people who did meditate had a significantly stronger effect. They were more or less the only ones, I think, in that study that showed effects. And it was a strong one. That, I think, is an experiment that's even better than the random number generator stuff. And I think that the future of consciousness research, fundamental consciousness research in this capacity, is going to be more like what Dean is doing. And in a way more like what we're doing, but kind of writ large. More and more people, and looking into things like expectation and belief systems and so forth. So everyone out there, meditate.
Yeah, just another positive benefit of meditating, that you could actually bend reality, and that's actual hard numbers to show that you can. I was also going to ask, with your app, are the users centralized around the San Francisco area? And if not, have you seen changes in randomness based off of where the city is?
Mm-hmm. Not yet. So we've only actually been testing. We haven't been testing very many because we haven't released the whole app out to the wider network. There's a greater concentration of users in California, which, go figure, no surprise. But the people on the wait list, the beta testers, are all over the planet. Wow, they really come from everywhere.
Amazing. That'll be amazing to see. Yeah, just differences in the deviation of randomness based off of the location. So when that's out and it's an alpha for everyone, hopefully we can all who's listening take part in that. Just switching things up a little bit, I'd just love to get your take on certain consciousness hacking technologies, because I know you are involved with the co-hacking movement out in the Bay Area. So I was just going to ask, is there any type of consciousness hacking technology or transformative technology, however you want to call it, that you use regularly in your own life?
Well, there's nothing that I use regularly, but I can tell you about the two most profound consciousness hacking techniques or technologies that I've come across, and I've tried them all.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one I can hint at it, but you'll have to have me back on, and we'll discuss it in general. But it's kind of a discovery that we made on accident, partly at Psyleron and partly at Entangled. And the effects are really, really cool, and they stay with you. And I think this is actually going to be the basis of some pretty exciting new technology, which we're kind of working on in parallel with the Entangled app. So hopefully in 2018 we'll come out with that. But I've been using an early R&D version of it, and so have several dozen of my friends, and the results are spooky. So I'm really excited about that one. But we'll leave it at that. And yeah, okay, we'll have a really good conversation about that one. So the second one is neurofeedback. And neurofeedback has been around for, I'm guessing it's been around in different ways for about 20 years. Basically, it's, for those who don't know, it's putting electrodes on your head that measure the electrical activity of your brain. And then through feedback, which is sounds or a vibrating pillow or something like that, you're asking your brain to change the way it works in order to mimic a certain electrical pattern or to operate in a certain way that it wasn't operating in before. And back in 2006, 2005, I spent a summer living in my car, and I was just driving around the country, and I happened to run into a gentleman named Marty Woodkey in the mountains in Georgia, and he was an early neurofeedback practitioner, and he had a practice there in his home. Most of what he did was helping, for example, children with ADD overcome their ADD without chemicals. So the parents would come to him, and he would put the electrodes on the kids, and they would make, the video game play or whatever, and that was feedback to train their brains to work in a way that was better for attention. Okay. What he also did, for example, was one of the things he did was he was, I think he was in Texas, but he was going to help homeless heroin addicts overcome their addiction using only neurofeedback. And in record time, he was able to get them not only off the drug, but to get their lives back together. Right? I think it was crack addicts, actually.
Wow.
But off the drug, and then their brains are just working correctly, and they're like humans again. And they could go and they'd get jobs and they get back into their homes. In the Netherlands, I think it was, he's like a hero. But the Netherlands insurance pays for neurofeedback. So more people use it. Here, neurofeedback is you can't get it in a reimbursement method. So anyway, that's what he did. He's kind of a miracle worker, but his side interest was may still be in researching meditators. So people that have experienced or achieved what we would call enlightenment. What do their brains look like? So he was part of a group of people that would study those who have been meditating in a cave for 30 years. And there's a couple of things that were very consistent among them. One is a condition called a reversal has been changed. And two is the frontal lobe is awake. And I'll get into what those two things mean in a second. But by looking at all of these sort of enlightened people that have been meditating for decades, using neurofeedback, his kind of side interest was in something that he called neurotheology, meaning can you put the electrodes on somebody and ask their brains to reproduce the patterns or behaviors of the meditators and get the same effects? And the answer is generally yes. And so I kind of volunteered myself to try this out, and I went later on in 2006 to spend 2 weeks with them doing an intensive twice-a-day session in neurotheology, and it was absolutely the most profound experience in my life. So what are the two things? What are the two sort of magical things? Well, the first is that the back part of our brains in most people, I'm talking virtually everyone here, the back part of the brain is concerned with memories, scripts, routines, This is the way things are. This is the way they've always, the chatter in your mind that you're trying to suppress when you're meditating. That's where all that stuff comes from, and that's sort of the back part of the brain, and that's awake. Now, the frontal lobe, which is the last to develop, sort of an evolution, it's anatomically what tends to separate us from, for example, animals. We have it in our brains, but it's not awake. It's very rarely awake. Only in some people is it awake, and only some of the time. So if you can quiet the back part of the brain using neurofeedback and wake up the frontal lobe, then all of a sudden what you have is the subjective experience of presence. So the frontal lobe is very involved in being here now and presence, which is the state that you want to. Once you're there, you want to stay there. it's what you want to achieve through meditation. It's also where real rational thought comes from. So it's the executive function of the brain, and it's where being able to see things as they are and dispassionately and make rational choices and decisions. That's frontal lobe activity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a frequency or an operating frequency called gamma. Gamma it's a range above beta. So anything that's 40 hertz and above is regarded to be gamma. Up until very recently, the EEG equipment was not able to detect things in the gamma range, or especially high gamma, largely because you have a 60 hertz electrical cycle, right, that can interfere with the ability to measure that part. But they also, most of the history of EEG research was kind of regarded gamma as maybe not even that possible. How could the brain fire at 40 hertz and above? At least that was maybe not the prevailing opinion, but that was one opinion. So when they finally discovered gamma and started measuring it, it kind of, you have to sort of recast most of your history of EEG research because you've got this new frequency to look at. And gamma is very interesting. So gamma is like a binding frequency, meaning that you might have theta and delta and alpha and all these things happening in your brain, but gamma kind of like, it binds them all together. It makes them synchronize or resonant or harmonious. And gamma isn't something that's constantly on. It's sort of on again, off again, on again, off again. And in that moment, it's as though, if you will, the whole brain is operating as one, maybe even as a single neuron. And so with gamma, you tend to get insights. You tend to get flashes of inspiration, of creativity, of things that suddenly come to you, like problems that resolve themselves. That's that kind of genius level functioning that gamma can provide. It also seems to be related to Kundalini. So that kind of yogic energy or creative energy that people have been writing about for a long time. Those who have had Kundalini awakenings, according to another friend of mine, their brains in that state tend to produce a ton of gamma. So there might be something there. So those are the two things. And those are the two things that, through neurofeedback with Marty Woodkey, I trained to produce in my brain.
That's amazing. And can you talk about the actual experience when it happened and just what was going through your consciousness? Like what was going on?
So it's not a toy. It's some really profound stuff. Really profound stuff. I mean, you're asking your brain to change in ways that is like learning Chinese in 2 weeks. With feedback, everything becomes faster. Right? So that includes changing who you are in your brain. So the first week is about opening up parts of your brain that have become relatively dormant. And that's necessary because you want a whole functioning brain, a healthy brain, to be able to accept these new ways of operating. So, which I think of as higher consciousness. And the brain is just operating better and more self-resonant or more coherent with itself. So, we all have these brains that are kind of like Swiss cheese, meaning that there's some parts that are relatively dormant, that are not producing the right patterns, some parts that are more awake and more active. And you kind of got to wake those up with neurofeedback. And you don't want to do it. It's like your brain resists it because your brain wants to stay a certain way, right? Your brain wants to stay in a certain state. That's what addiction is, right? It's the brain chemically going, no, no, I don't want to. No, I want to stay in this state. And so it's hard to do. And so, if there's no real problem, then we don't really do it. So when I was waking up certain parts of my brain that were relatively dormant, all of these, basically like all of these emotional, like, I hesitate to call them traumas, but a lot of things that were really emotionally upsetting to me as a kid kind of came out. Like I started remembering all of these things. And I went home and I filled out this whole notebook full of just like emotional stuff that was just coming back to me that I wasn't remembering. That was a trip. So you do this for, at least for me, it was about the first week, and you don't feel good. You feel really bad. If you don't feel really bad, but you feel strange, like you're reliving all of this emotional content, and it's tough. And also, your brain is operating differently, so your subjective sense of who you are, what it's like to be you, that changes. And that is bizarre because it's like you're now, your name is the same and you look the same, but it's like what it's like to be you is now different. You're now somebody else, which is trippy. So that's a lot to process. You don't want to be, you want to be in a quiet space where you can do a lot of processing when this stuff is happening. So anyway, that's tough. The second week is when you start to awaken the frontal lobe and to bring gamma into the picture, and then all of that bad stuff goes away, and it's like the most profound meditation that you've ever had, but times 10, or at least for me it was. The frontal lobe awakens, and you start to feel not like your head is in the clouds. It's not a kind of transcendence or like a state of being that is ephemeral. It's the opposite. It's much, much more grounded and here and now than you were before, which was kind of surprising, but it makes sense. So like, to me, I kind of relate enlightenment to be not as a transcendence, but as a deepening of your presence, of being really, really here. And once you kind of feel through feedback what it's like to have your frontal lobe awake, you can more easily reproduce it. Yeah.
That's amazing. And can you just repeat the individual you went through, and if he does any of these trainings currently?
I believe he still has a clinic. His name is Marty Wuttke. Search Wuttke, and I'm planning to get back in touch with him and maybe do another session. It's been more than a decade. But awesome. I think that he has moved from Georgia to Santa Barbara. So he's in California now. I know that he kind of splits his time between Netherlands and California, but you'll be able to get a hold of him there on his website.
Awesome. Well, that'll be on the blog post for you guys. Adam, thanks so much for sitting down with me. If folks want to learn more about you and Entangled and all your work, where can they best find that good stuff online? Sure.
Entangled.org. Or just search Google for Consciousness app, and it's the first few pages of results.
All right. Thanks, Adam, for sitting down with me. If you enjoyed today's episode, go check out his app at entangled.org. There you can sign up for the waiting list, and hopefully you can get your hands on the app when it's out in alpha for everyone. And if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast Warrior Radio. Subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a rating, because ratings would actually push our podcast up the iTunes store and get a lot of these fringe, little understood, little talked about topics out into the masses. So with all that said, I want to say thanks to you for sitting down with me, and I will see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.